You ever notice how every neighborhood has that one guy? The one who thinks the HOA is his personal kingdom? Well, ours had Doyle Mason. Now, Doyle wasn't elected. He wasn't on the board. He wasn't even appointed. He just decided one day that he was the sheriff of suburbia. Clipboard under his arm. Cheap pen clicking louder than a metronome. Phone always ready to snap pictures. And let me tell you, he strutted around like he had a badge pinned to his chest. The truth? He was nothing more than a nosy busybody with too much free time and an ego bigger than the whole cul-de-sac. But in his head, oh, he was a law. It was 5:30 in the morning. The sky was still gray. The neighborhood still quiet. Most folks were in bed, fans humming, dreams rolling. And then, creak, that familiar sound cut through the silence. The sound was bending under weight. I was at the kitchen counter, groggy, pouring cereal into a bowl, when Grandpa's voice came from the porch. Hum, he muttered, rocking chair creaking behind him. There he goes again. I froze, cereal box in hand. Then I leaned toward the window, and sure enough, there he was, Doyle Mason, in all his self-appointed glory, climbing our backyard fence, phone flashlight flickering in the dim light, boots scraping the wood. The man moved with the twitchy confidence of someone who'd done it so often. Shame didn't even cross his mind anymore. And what was he after? Tomatoes. Grandpa's tomato plants. Now listen, these weren't some wild jungle vines taking over the neighborhood. They were just tomatoes. Vines neatly tied to stakes. Fat red fruit hanging heavy. Leaves green and healthy. The kind of garden a 75-year-old veteran tends to with quiet pride. But to Doyle, they were a violation of community standards. A crime against the sacred aesthetic of Maple Court. He muttered under his breath as he snapped photos, angling his phone like he was gathering evidence for trial. Click, click, click. I clenched my jaw. My fist tightened. Every part of me wanted to throw open the door and march out there, to call him out, record him, shout until the whole street heard. But then, Grandpa's hand rose. Slow, calm, like he'd been expecting this exact moment. Patience, he whispered, eyes locked on Doyle. Let a fool hang himself long enough, and he'll kick the chair out from under his own feet. That was Grandpa's way. Measured, steady, never raising his voice when silence could say more, never fighting with fists when time could sharpen the knife. So there he sat, rocking gently, steam curling from his coffee, watching Doyle paw at tomato leaves like they were contraband. The old man didn't twitch a muscle, didn't flinch, didn't blink. Meanwhile, Doyle crouched low, ruler in hand, measuring the vines like he was conducting a scientific investigation. I shook my head, whispering, "It's just tomatoes." Grandpa's lips curled into the faintest smile. To him, it's a battle, he said. To us, it's breakfast. That's the difference. Thing is, this wasn't Doyle's first rodeo. Not even close. We'd caught him before, rattling the shed door like he thought we were hiding stolen goods, poking around the flower beds with a flashlight, jotting notes about invasive plants. Neighbors had stories, too. He measured their lawns with rulers in the middle of the night. He told kids their bikes were unsightly hazards. He even stood on tiptoe to peek through windows, said he was checking for code compliance. The man was a menace, but to the HOA, he was just enthusiastic. That was Linda Clay's word for him, the HOA president. Every time Grandpa complained, she brushed it off with that fake smile of hers. Oh, Doyle just cares about the neighborhood. Cares? Please. Enthusiasm doesn't excuse trespassing, and the law sure didn't back him up either. North Carolina General Statute 14 to 159.13 made it clear stepping onto private property without consent was trespassing, but the sheriff's deputies called it a gray area. Unless we caught Doyle in the act and pressed charges immediately, it was just our word against his. And Doyle knew it. That's why he climbed fences like a cat burglar at dawn. He thought he was untouchable. But that morning, something changed. Grandpa didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't storm into the yard. He just sat there, coffee cooling on the porch rail, eyes narrowed like a hawk. When Doyle finally scuttled back over the fence, phone full of pictures, Grandpa stayed quiet for a long, long moment. Then he stood, stretched his back, and said 6 words that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It's time he learned his lesson. For the next 3 days, the garage became his workshop. Metal clinked, tools buzzed. I heard the low hum of drills, the occasional sharp curse, and always, the steady rhythm of old country songs humming from his lips. I played assistant, fetching wrenches, holding flashlights, handing him spools of wire. And every time I asked what he was building, he just grinned. You'll see soon enough. By the 4th day, the gate at the end of our driveway wasn't just a gate anymore. It was something new, something waiting. Thick wires ran clean along the frame, tucked neat like they'd always belonged there. A low-voltage electrical unit, legal under state code, hummed quietly behind the bushes. Perfectly legal, perfectly documented. And right there, nailed to the post in bold black letters on bright yellow plastic. High voltage warning, electrified gate. Trespassers will be shocked. High voltage. This wasn't Doyle's first trespass. Not even close. The man treated Maple Court like his own private investigation zone. And every one of us, every neighbor, every homeowner, was a suspect. We caught him rattling the lock on Grandpa's shed one morning, his scrawny fingers tugging at the handle like he expected contraband to tumble out. When Grandpa stepped outside, Doyle didn't even flinch. He just muttered something about unpermitted structures and scurried off like a rat caught in the pantry. Another time, I looked up from my homework and nearly jumped out of my skin. There he was, his pale face pressed against our living room window, his breath fogging the glass. He cupped his hands to block the glare, peering in like a burglar casing the place. When Grandpa asked him what in the world he thought he was doing, Doyle calmly claimed he was checking compliance. Compliance? For what? Curtains? And if that wasn't enough, there was a day we caught him crouched in the flower beds. Grandpa's petunias weren't contraband, but the way Doyle poked at the soil, scribbling notes in his clipboard, you'd think he'd just uncovered a crime scene. And it wasn't just us. Word spread across the street like wildfire. Old Mr. Harris swore Doyle had measured the cracks in his driveway with a tape measure, muttering something about hazard standards. Mrs. Nguyen said she woke at dawn to see Doyle crouched by her shrubs, flashlight beaming, scribbling again. Even the Johnson kids weren't safe. Doyle wagged his finger at them for leaving bikes near the sidewalk, calling them dangerous obstructions. To everyone else, Maple Court was a neighborhood. To Doyle Mason, it was his personal police beat. And here's where it got worse. Every complaint, every call, every plea to the HOA fell flat. Because at the center of it all was Linda Clay, HOA president, queen of polished pearls and plastered smiles. We'd sit at those HOA meetings, neighbors' voices rising, frustration spilling into the air. And Linda would lean back, hands folded, that fake warmth dripping from her voice. "Oh, Doyle's just enthusiastic," she'd say. Enthusiastic about keeping our community beautiful. Enthusiastic? That word drove Grandpa mad. Because what Linda called enthusiasm, the rest of us called trespassing. It wasn't enthusiasm to rattle a 75-year-old veteran's shed door. It wasn't enthusiasm to snap photos of tomato plants like they were illegal crops. It wasn't enthusiasm to peek through windows at 6 in the morning. No, that wasn't enthusiasm. That was obsession. But Linda, Linda hid behind that word like it was armor. And as long as she smiled, Doyle had cover. We even called the sheriff's office once. Deputies showed up, listened, nodded their heads, even shook them in disbelief. And when Grandpa asked what could be done, one of them sighed. Unless you catch him in the act, unless you press charges on the spot, it's your word against his. A gray area, they called it. A gap in the law big enough for Doyle, to crawl right through. And the worst part? Doyle knew it. That smug smirk he wore whenever Grandpa confronted him, that wasn't confidence. That was the look of a man who believed he was untouchable. The HOA had his back. The law shrugged its shoulders, and we were left with a prowler in our yard, free to do it again and again. But see, Grandpa wasn't like me. I wanted to storm out there, to shout, to shove the phone out of Doyle's hand and tell him to never come back. But Grandpa, he was steady, measured, the kind of man who believed patience was sharper than anger and silence louder than shouting. Let a fool talk long enough, he always said, and he'll trip over his own tongue. Let a fool act long enough, and he'll dig his own grave. So when Doyle trespassed again, rattling the shed, poking at flower beds, snapping pictures of tomatoes, Grandpa didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he sat on that porch, sipping his coffee, eyes narrowed like a hawk tracking prey. And then he stood, slowly, calmly. "It's time," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Time he learned a lesson. That's when Grandpa disappeared into the garage. For 3 days, the air rang with the sounds of tinkering. Metal clinking, drills buzzing, saw blades whining. The smell of oil, solder, and burnt rubber drifted through the yard. Every now and then, I'd hear him humming. Old country tunes, low and steady, echoing beneath the garage rafters. Tunes that told me he wasn't angry, he was focused. And that was worse. Much worse. I played assistant, fetching him tools when he asked, holding flashlights when his hands were full, watching as he pieced together something I couldn't quite understand. "Grandpa," I asked more than once, "what are you building?" Each time, he gave the same answer. "You'll see." By the 4th day, it was ready. Our iron gate, the one at the end of the driveway, didn't just creak on its hinges anymore. It hummed. Neat wires, fastened clean along the frame, connected to a low-voltage electrical unit, mounted discreetly behind the bushes. Nothing sloppy. Nothing makeshift. This was precise. Legal. Safe, but not for Doyle Mason. And Grandpa had made sure it followed every rule in the book. A laminated permit tucked neatly into a folder. Paperwork signed and stamped. Everything filed exactly as it should be. And then, just to drive the point home, he nailed a bright yellow sign to the post. Warning, electrified gate. Trespassers will be shocked. That night, Grandpa sat back in his rocker, thermos of coffee steaming beside him. The hum of the gate buzzed faintly in the quiet air. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the street, like a hunter waiting for the trap to spring. I stood behind him, restless, pacing. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered. He didn't even look at me. "Son," he said, calm as the night sky, "patience mixed with planning is the sharpest weapon a man can wield." The chair creaked beneath his weight. The gate hummed in the shadows. And all we had to do was wait. The morning Doyle returned, the neighborhood woke to more than birdsong. The sky was just starting to pale with that pinkish hue, the kind that makes the streetlights flicker off one by one. Our yard was still soaked in dew, the air sharp and cool. Grandpa was already on the porch, rocking slow, thermos in his hand like always. He looked like a man who had nothing but time. Me? I was crouched low by the window, heart pounding hard enough I swore Doyle could hear it through the fence. Then came the sound, gravel crunching under boots. The rhythm of someone moving with purpose, but not caution. That's how Doyle walked, like the world was his front yard and he owned every blade of grass on it. His silhouette came into view, scrawny frame outlined against a faint morning light, clipboard under his arm, phone in hand, that same smug tilt to his chin as if today he'd finally catch us red-handed. But what Doyle didn't know was that today wasn't going to be like the others. He reached the gate and muttered something about violations. I couldn't hear the words exactly, but I knew the tone, the way he always said it, like he was judge and jury rolled into one. He leaned in, glove-covered hand wrapping around the iron bar. And then it happened. Snap! A jolt ran through him so fast his whole body stiffened like a wooden board. His knees buckled, his arms flailed, and a strangled yelp tore from his throat. The sound wasn't just a shout. It was a sharp cry of a man who realized in one blinding second, that he wasn't untouchable after all. He stumbled backward, boots skidding across the gravel until he landed square in the dirt. For a moment, he just sat there, stunned, blinking like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over his head. Then, with a groan, he scrambled to his feet, brushing at his clothes like the mud was somehow to blame. Neighbors had started peeking out from curtains and cracked open doors. One by one, faces appeared half hidden, eyes wide. Mrs. Nguyen, coffee mug in hand, froze on her porch steps. Mr. Harris leaned against his mailbox, lips twitching as if he couldn't decide whether to laugh. Even the Johnson kids pressed their faces to their upstairs window, giggling behind their hands. Doyle tried to straighten himself up, but there was no hiding it. His shirt was rumpled, his pants smeared with dirt, and his expression, his expression was priceless. Red-faced, eyes wide, humiliated, and through it all, Grandpa didn't move a muscle. He rocked once, twice, brought his thermos to his lips, took a long sip like he'd been waiting for this exact moment all week. And then, in that gravelly voice of his, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "That was the sound of justice." I nearly choked on my own breath. Doyle staggered off, limping slightly, muttering under his breath about lawsuits and violations. He cast one last glare at the gate, but didn't dare touch it again. He disappeared down the sidewalk, tried to regain his dignity, but there was no saving it. By noon, the whole street was buzzing. Word spread faster than wildfire. Maple Court was alive with whispers and chuckles. You couldn't step outside without catching pieces of the story. Did you hear? Doyle got himself zapped. Serve him right. Finally, some were half shocked, their voices lowered as if afraid Doyle might still be lurking. Others couldn't hide their amusement, smiling openly at the thought of the so-called HOA patrol being taken down a peg. Even kids on bikes zipped past, mimicking an exaggerated jolt with their arms flailing like puppets. Doyle, of course, wasn't about to let it go quietly. He limped around the neighborhood, arms stiff, claiming Grandpa had built a death trap. He told anyone who'd listened that it was dangerous, illegal, a menace to the community. He showed off a tiny red welt on his wrist like it was a battle scar from the front lines. He painted himself as the victim, the brave guardian of neighborhood standards, nearly killed in the line of duty. But the neighbors weren't buying it. Not this time. Everyone had seen Doyle's antics, his late-night snooping, his endless photographs, his measuring tape clicking in the dead of night. Everyone had a story of him sticking his nose where it didn't belong. And deep down they knew what happened wasn't a trap. It wasn't an accident. It was justice, plain and simple. Still, Doyle strutted on, trying to spin his tail. He waved his clipboard around like it was proof of authority. He pointed at Grandpa's yard with dramatic flair, claiming that the old man was a danger to the entire neighborhood. But the looks he got in return weren't sympathy. They were smirks, eye rolls, and the occasional stifled laugh. Because here's the thing about justice. It doesn't always come with a gavel or a badge. Sometimes it comes with a little electricity and a man too stubborn to see it coming. That night, I sat on the porch with Grandpa, the hum of the gate faint in the background. The air was cool, filled with the quiet rustle of leaves. I couldn't stop grinning, replaying the image of Doyle's arms flailing, his yelp echoing down the street. "Think he'll come back?" I asked. Grandpa leaned back, staring out into the dark. His eyes, steady and calm, glinted in the porch light. "Oh, he'll be back," he said, sipping from his thermos. Men like him don't learn from pain. They only learn when the world finally shows them they're not in charge. And he was right, because for Doyle Mason, one shock wasn't going to be enough. He wasn't just a trespasser. He was obsessed. And obsessed men don't walk away from humiliation. They double down. They come back, even when every sign tells them to stay away. But for now, the street was calm. The neighbors had their gossip. Doyle had his limp. And Grandpa had his victory. Sometimes justice is loud and messy. Sometimes it's a courtroom or a police report. But that morning, justice was the sound of electricity snapping through iron, echoing across Maple Court, and silencing the self-appointed patrol, if only for a little while. They called it an emergency HOA meeting, which really just meant they wanted the drama while the gossip was still hot. By 6 that evening, the clubhouse at the end of Maple Court was lit up like a stage. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum, and someone had set out a tray of store-bought cookies like sugar could sweeten what was coming. Doyle arrived first, of course he did, his right arm wrapped in a sling far too big for the job. He wore like a badge, chin high, the picture of wounded authority. He paced in front of the long conference table and pointed before he even sat down. "This man endangers a community with an electrified weapon," he announced, stabbing a finger at Grandpa as we walked in. Half the room jumped. The other half rolled their eyes. Grandpa didn't speed up, didn't slow down either. He took the aisle like a man taking his usual seat on a Sunday train, hat tipped slightly, steps even, thermos tucked under his elbow. He chose a chair 3 rows back and lowered himself with a soft creak, the kind of sound that said he'd been sitting in chairs like this his whole life. I sat beside him, feeling the room throb with whispers. At the head of the table sat Linda Clay, all pearls and posture, palms flattened against a neat stack of papers. To her left were the other board members, Todd with the too-tight tie, Marianne, who always looked like she smelled something sour, and Greg, who never spoke unless someone told him to. Linda offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're here," she said, voice syrupy, "to discuss a serious safety matter." "Attempted murder," Doyle added loudly. A few people snorted. One of the Johnson kids, sitting on the back row with her mom, muffled a giggle behind her hand. Linda rapped the gavel. "Doyle." He lifted his sling a touch higher, as if to remind us. "I was performing an inspection." "Inspection?" someone muttered near the door. "At sunrise." "And I was violently shocked by an illegally electrified fence," he continued, ignoring the peanut gallery. "This resident has installed a hazardous device." Grandpa's thermos cap clicked softly as he unscrewed it. He poured coffee into the lid, like this was any other evening on the porch and not a trial by neighbor. When he finally stood, he didn't look at Doyle. He looked at Linda, and then, with the same calm he used to read morning headlines, he slid a laminated sheet across the aisle to the front table. Todd sprang from his chair to grab it like it might explode. "That," Grandpa said, "is a permit. Low voltage. Compliant under the code. Installation inspected last Thursday. Warning signage posted in plain sight." Todd stared at the paper, mouth moving as he read. Greg leaned over his shoulder. Marianne pinched her lips and reached for the hand sanitizer like the permit might be contagious. Linda smiled harder. "Even if this is technically allowable, Mr. Thompson, it's aggressive. We prefer a spirit of harmony." People felt threatened. Grandpa nodded once. "So did I." "By what?" Doyle barked. "Tomatoes." A soft laugh rippled across the room. Grandpa didn't take the bait. He set the thermos lid down on the chair seat, then folded both hands over the top of it. "Mrs. Clay," he said, voice low and steady. "3 times this man entered my yard without permission. Once at the shed, twice over the fence. I reported each instance. You dismissed each as, what was the word?" "Enthusiasm," someone in the back supplied. "Enthusiasm," Grandpa repeated. "I posted warnings. I called the sheriff. I asked your board to intervene. I did not escalate. I documented. And I installed a lawful deterrent with clear signage. Next time he trespasses, I will press charges. That's all I have." He sat. Nothing dramatic. No flourish. Just a clean end to a carefully drawn line. For a heartbeat, the room hung there, suspended. Then it shifted, so faint you could miss it if you weren't watching. People turned not toward Doyle, but toward each other. There's a kind of courage that moves like a breeze, invisible until you feel its hand on your shoulder. It started with a small woman near the wall, gray cardigan, soft hands fidgeting with a bracelet. "He came into my backyard," she said, voice shaking at first, then steadying. "I thought I was the only one. He measured my shrubs, told me the variety was non-compliant. I didn't even know what that meant." 2 rows up, a man with paint on his cuticles lifted his chin. He took pictures of my kids' bikes, called them an eyesore. My boys are 6 and 8. Heads turned, faces tightened. The Johnson mom raised a hand next. He circled our block 2 nights in a row after 10, parked with the lights off, said he was observing patterns. My daughter wouldn't go outside. Now the stories came faster, a staccato line of small humiliations, a tape measure clicking in the dark, flashbulbs through blinds, notes tucked on doors like citations from a court that didn't exist. Each testimony bent the floorboards a little. Doyle's face went the color of raw meat. That is all hearsay, he snapped. I am authorized to conduct assessments on behalf of the... You're not authorized, Todd blurted, still staring at the permit as if it had rearranged his understanding of the world. We don't have a field inspector role. At least not formally. Marianne cleared her throat. We have neighborhood standards. We encourage vigilance. Vigilance isn't midnight with a flashlight, Mr. Harris said from the doorway. He'd come in late, leaning on his cane. Vigilance isn't scaring children. And it sure ain't rattling doors that don't belong to you. Linda picked up the gavel, then put it down. The pearls at her throat looked suddenly heavy. She tried for her smile again and came up short. Let's maintain decorum, she said, but even her own board wasn't looking at her anymore. They were looking at the neighbors, at the stories, at Doyle. Doyle took a step forward, and the sling bounced like a prop. This is a witch hunt. The real issue is the weaponized fence. The real issue, Grandpa said, not rising this time, not even raising his voice, is trespass. It was quiet enough to hear the air conditioner kick on. Someone coughed. The Johnson kid stifled another laugh and failed. Linda's eyes flicked to the permit again, like it might offer a way out. We can certainly review the aesthetic impact of the installation, she offered weakly. Grandpa turned his palm up. Regulate aesthetics. That's your lane. The law is mine. From the back corner, a tall woman with paint-spattered jeans lifted her phone. I've got footage, she said. 2 nights ago. He walked right up my driveway, filmed to the car window, then moved to the side yard. At 11:42 p.m., she held the screen up. A few people gasped softly at the glow. Doyle's mouth opened and closed. He switched tracks. I was responding to reports. People come to me because the board won't act. Linda flinched at that. We have processes, Doyle. Your processes are slow, he snapped. Standards decay when no one enforces them. Standards, Mr. Harris said, tapping his cane once, aren't worth a nickel if you throw neighborly decency into the ditch to get them. It should have been small, that tap of the cane. It sounded like a gavel. Eyes went to Grandpa. He didn't bask. He didn't smirk. He just lifted the thermos lid, took a quiet sip, and looked content to let the room write its own ending. Finally, Linda squared the papers that didn't need squaring and tried to find the voice she'd practiced in the mirror. Given the information shared, the board will form a committee to review boundary concerns, clarify access policies, and... No committees, Marion said, surprising everyone, including herself. This is simple. No one enters private property without permission. Full stop. Todd nodded slowly. And we should issue guidance about after dark observation. He looked at Doyle and then down again. As in, don't. Greg cleared his throat for perhaps the first time all year. And we should apologize. The word hovered there like a bird testing the air. Apologize. To whom? To everyone, maybe. Doyle's ears burned. You're all missing the point. That old man. Enough, Linda said, and for once the word had spine. She turned to Grandpa. Mr. Thompson, we acknowledge your permit and signage are in order. We ask that you, consider the visual impact of your deterrent, but we recognize your right to protect your property. We will draft and publish a policy clarifying that no board member or resident may enter private property for inspection without explicit consent. Period. A murmur swelled. Relief, maybe, or the first breath after holding it too long. Chairs squeaked. People leaned back like some weight had let go of their shoulders. Grandpa dipped his head. Nothing grand, just a nod that said he'd expected nothing more and would accept nothing less. He stood, slid the thermos under his arm, and turned toward the aisle. Doyle lunged half a step, sling and all. This is a miscarriage. He's dangerous. That device. Grandpa paused just long enough to look at him, not with anger, not with triumph, with a kind of tired kindness that carried more force than any word. "Don't touch my gate," he said. No thunder, no lightning, just a gentle grind of chair legs and the soft thump of feet as neighbors stood to leave, some stopping by Grandpa to squeeze his shoulder, some whispering thanks, some walking past Doyle without seeing him at all. By the time we reached the door, the sky outside had gone the color of cooling iron. Porch lights blinked on across Maple Court, one after another, like a row of sentries. Behind us, the gavel finally came down. 3 quick strikes that sounded smaller than Mr. Harris's cane. On the steps, I asked what he thought would happen next. Grandpa tightened the thermos cap and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Men who build their authority on fear don't lose it gracefully," he said. But it's not his room anymore. When we crossed our yard, the faint hum from the gate met us like a familiar tune. The yellow warning sign gleamed softly in the porch light. Through the window blinds, I could see curtains twitch on our street. People settling back into their ordinary evenings with something like peace. Somebody laughed, far off. Not cruel, just relieved. And for the first time in a long time, Maple Court sounded like a neighborhood again. Midnight changes the way a street sounds. Maple Court, usually a place of sprinklers and kids on scooters, turned into a hollow tunnel of crickets and distant highway hum. Porch lights were off, curtains shut, houses crouched in silhouettes. The only glow came from the soft square of our front window and the pale, patient moon. Grandpa sat at his rocker like a lighthouse keeper, the faintest blue from the TV flickering through the screen door behind him. He had the remote in one hand and his thermos on the table, steam curling up like a secret. He looked as if he'd been carved there. Steady, unmovable, the man who waits because he knows what's coming. At first, I thought the noise was a raccoon in the trash. A dry rustle, a dull clink, a pause. Then the beam of a flashlight wavered across the post of the gate and landed on the yellow sign, bright as a warning star. The beam held. The silhouette halted. Then the light dipped, searching. Bolt cutters gleamed when they caught the moon, a clean, predatory shine. The figure's shoulders hunched, and I didn't need to see his face to know the shape of his stubbornness. Doyle was back. He didn't slink. He moved like a man narrating his own heroism, a little louder in his breath than he needed to be. The clicks of metal on metal performed to an invisible audience. He crouched, tested a link with his gloved thumb, then stood and set the jaws of the cutter against the iron like the act itself would rewrite the law. I felt my chest tighten, a thin wire drawn through me. I glanced at Grandpa. He didn't look at me. He looked at the gate with the same quiet attention he'd give to a weather forecast he already knew by heart. The remote nestled in his palm like a promise. "Watch this," he said so softly the night almost swallowed it. The flashlight circle shook once as Doyle adjusted his grip and committed. Metal teeth bit iron. Zap! It wasn't loud, not like a movie. It was a crack and a bite, a single bright spit of blue where steel met charged steel. Doyle jerked like someone had yanked a rug out from under his bones. The cutters clanged against the post and fell into the mud with a weighty thud. He stumbled backward, legs tangling, one boot skidding on the wet grass until he sat down hard, palms slapping the ground. A hiss of breath left him, then a strangled sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a word. More the sound a man makes when the story he told about himself breaks in his hands. He scrambled, grabbed for the flashlight. It rolled, beam spinning over the yard like a panicked searchlight, and he found his feet by orbiting the chaos. Mud smeared his knees, a streak of it across his shirt. He looked down at the gate as if it had insulted him personally. Then he did what cowards do when they find out pain has rules. He reached for the nearest stage. He pulled out his phone and jabbed at the screen with frantic certainty. "Attempted murder," he shouted the moment the call took. "He's trying to kill me with a booby-trap fence. Send someone now." Grandpa didn't stand. He didn't even uncross his ankles. He set the remote on the table and lifted the thermos lid. The steam smelled like black coffee, clean and bitter, a midnight sermon. From a window, I saw the way his mouth almost smiled, not happy, not cruel. Something like inevitable, The sirens came slower than Doyle's panic made in his head, but quicker than most nights see. Red and blue washed over the street in tidal pulses. The neighborhood stirred. The practice lifted blinds by 2 inches, the soft creak of a door chain. Silhouettes arriving on porches with arms folded into bathrobes. The cruiser rolled to a stop in front of our yard, a second one idle behind it. 2 deputies stepped out, their voices calm in that trained way you can feel in your bones. The shorter one took consign, the gate, the glistening bolt cutters in the mud. The taller's eyes moved from the warning placard to the porch. To Grandpa, the Doyle's clothes and hands. Evening, the taller one said. Attempted murder. Doyle repeated, not evening at all. He waved the phone. He electrified his property to injure me. It is a lethal device. I demand you arrest. The shorter deputy held up a hand. Sir, take a breath. Grandpa finally rose. He did like he always did, slow, careful, a courtesy to old knees and anyone watching. He picked up a plastic sleeve from the porch table, the laminated permit catching the cruiser lights, and throwing them back pale and official. In his other hand, he held his phone, already cued to a video thumbnail that showed a man and a pair of bolt cutters lit by a tight white circle. The taller deputy met him halfway. You the homeowner? Robert Thompson, Grandpa said. Permits current. Low voltage, signage posted. Video is time-stamped. The deputy took the sleeve, scanned the top, flipped to the line that mattered, then looked at the sign on the post again. He nodded once. You said video? Grandpa tapped play and turned the screen. It was all there, crisp and unflattering. Doyle stepping into frame with the entitlement of a man who's never been told no, the bolt cutters rising, the caption at the bottom marking time, the sign in the corner declaring the warning any child could read, the spark, the drop, the scramble, Doyle's voice on his own phone, pitching the theater. The deputies didn't trade glances. They didn't need to. The shorter one turned to Doyle. Sir, did you enter this property without the owner's consent? I was conducting an inspection for the HOA, Doyle said, recovering his clipped certainty. There have been repeated violations here, and I was... The deputy's eyebrow tilted. At midnight, with bolt cutters. Silence found a chair in the yard and sat with us. Sir, the tall one said, and there was no anger in it, only firm ground. You're under arrest for criminal trespass, vandalism, and filing a false police report. He took Doyle's wrist, turned him neatly, and the cuffs sang their simple song. The flashlight beam quivered over the grass, as if trying to find a different ending for him and failing. The sound that rose then didn't creep. It swelled, clapping. Not sarcastic, not angry, relieved. Palms meeting in praise of boundaries restaked, of night made ordinary again. Mrs. Nguyen stood at the edge of her steps and clapped with her mug still in her hand. Mr. Harris, in a bathrobe and slippers, tapped his cane in rhythm. The Johnson kids' faces glowed in their upstairs window like 2 small moons. Doyle shouted over it. You don't understand. He's armed his house. He'll hurt someone. The words bounced off something that wasn't a wall. It was the absence of attention. The slow turn of a street away from a man who had lived on their nerves for too long. Grandpa didn't address him. He sat back down and let the rocker find its groove again. The thermos lid was warm in his palm, and he breathed the steam like a man who'd come through a winter to find his porch still his. The shorter deputy picked up the cutters with 2 fingers and dropped them into an evidence bag, the plastic crackling as it closed. We'll need copies of that video, sir. I'll airdrop it, I said, and realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. The taller deputy handed back the permit, careful not to smudge it. Everything looks in order on your end. We'll note the signage in our report. Grandpa nodded. Appreciate you, officers. Need for Control was bright and posted and true. Across the street, a door opened wider. More neighbors drifted to their porches, gathering into that loose, late-night congregation only small streets know. The applause faded into murmurs, some laughter, relief loosening shoulders you could see even in the dark. A dog barked twice, and then remembered the hour. They guided Doyle to the cruiser. He tried one last glare at the gate, but glare is a weak tool, when the world has seen you with a pair of bolt cutters in your hand and your story turned inside out. The back door closed with that padded thunk, and the light spun once like a slow exhale. Sometimes, Grandpa said, and his voice was more tired than triumphant, more human than hard, justice just needs a little electricity. He didn't wink. He didn't look for anyone to write it down. He lifted the cup to his lips and let the night be the witness. When the cars rolled away, the quiet didn't feel nervous anymore. It felt earned. Neighbors drifted back into houses, the way you do after fireworks. Still talking, still smiling, carrying the last sparks with them. The gate hummed its small, steady hum, the sign's yellow square catching the porch light, like a beacon for common sense. We stepped inside, and the house took us back with the soft clicks and sighs of an old friend settling into sleep. In the morning, the street would have stories. In the afternoon, the HOA would have minutes to write and words to choose carefully. But right then, Maple Court belonged to crickets and the cooling air and a front porch where a man could sit with his coffee and know the border between his life and another man's.